Celebrate our bicentenary. We are, or will be in about 3 months, 200 years old. And we're 200 years special, I think. Birkbeck really is a very special place. We've been, relevant to today's lecture, we have been all through our history innovative. We've always been ahead of the curve. We've always been experimenting, reinventing ourselves. But most important, I think, we've always kept to our mission. And I always define our mission as providing a university, a high quality university education to those people who can't get it through the normal university offer that universities make. And we've had to change ourselves repeatedly through those 200 years in order to continue with that mission. And we are continuing to have to change ourselves in order to do that, because the mission is and the values are what is important, not our offer at a particular time. And I think there's a lot of similarity between Birkbeck and Ken, and I was thinking about those similarities.
200 years old.
Thank you, Ken. You can see it's going to be a good evening. And I have to tell you, being on a board with Ken is just like that, because he always contradicts you. And what's irritating is he's almost always right as well. But,
I can't disagree with
well,
that.
Okay, so let's go for the jugular. We both, Birkbeck and Ken, both come from actually very humble beginnings. We started off with a number of radicals wanting to provide education to people who would otherwise be autodidacts who would have to educate themselves. Ken comes from really humble beginnings in Nottingham, from the wrong side of the tracks, and he's got to where he's got through his own efforts, through his own determination. And the sort of qualities I lay out for Ken are the sort of qualities that I hope we can claim for Birkbeck too. And I wrote a few of them down. Ken is an iconoclast. Whenever you argue or discuss something with Ken, he always takes not a contrarian view, but a different view, a new view. He looks at things from a different perspective. And I hope that's something we do at Birkbeck. Ken has great courage. And I think we have that at Birkbeck too, because we have the courage to be different. Ken has repeatedly started new organizations and repeatedly, when he's needed to, picked himself up when things have gone wrong. He has great expertise. And I hope you'll discover that this evening as he talks. You can't get anywhere without knowing what you're talking about. But he also works extraordinarily hard. I've never come to a meeting with Ken and not found that he's read the papers rather more thoroughly than I have, and he knows the footnotes rather better than I do. But Ken, I read in something you did about that your personal motto is do well, do good. And I hope, again, that's what we try to do at Birkbeck. We do try and do well. We try to have the highest standards. We do high quality, but we do try to do good. We try to do good in this world. And if you were to look Ken up go to social media, you see that the length of the list of his philanthropic interventions, not only giving money, but giving time, setting up organizations, helping organizations, good organizations, is very long. So he is really a fine man, and he's going to tell us something about his personal journey today. So the format is going to be, Ken's going to talk for about 20 minutes, telling us about his journey, the firsts that he's done, and the innovations he's done. Then we'll have another 20 minutes when Professor David Latchman, our Vice Chancellor, will come, and there'll be a sort of interchange between the two of them. And after that, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, which David will moderate. And after that, perhaps most importantly, we will have a reception and there'll be some drinks. So, and I should add that this event is being live streamed and it'll be on the Birkbeck YouTube channel. So without more ado, Ken, please tell us what you've done with your life and how that applies to Birkbeck.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Actually, I'm now standing here blushing in front of everybody I wasn't expecting such a fulsome introduction. So you find me somewhat lost for words for a change, and possibly the first time in our relationship. But I shall get over it as quickly as I possibly can. So I am going to answer the question, my own question here, which is lifelong learning, an indulgence or a strategic imperative. Actually, in the 21st century where social media is everything, why don't we just cut to the chase? The answer is B, so we can move on now and talk about something else if you like. The only difference between me and social media is that I do have some evidence for B, but it is still going to be B. So for those of you who are already bored by what I've got to say, I'll wake you up when it's the drinks time. B is the answer. Thinking about how to answer my own question, which, by the way, those of you who get to do your exams is a really good way of passing exams, is to make sure it's your question that you get to answer, not somebody who knows what they're talking about. I thought that I need to provide some kind of framework to justify B as the answer. But for those not following my point so far, B is the answer. But I need to find some evidence to justify B as the answer. As Andrew just said, in the meetings where I don't think we ever disagreed on anything, actually, in the various board meetings, things we've been on. And I just have to tell you one story about Andrew, as he's done that about me, which is we both found ourselves in a debate in the Cambridge Union. Not actually as undergraduates, because although we probably are about the same age, we didn't know each other then, but in some summer recess when no children were there at Cambridge, no undergraduates, I should say, children were there, but we were in this debate against, obviously against another side, and neither of us really cared what the debate was going to be, because it was the joy of actually turning up in the Cambridge Union to have a debate, until we found out which side we were on. And the debate was, this House believes that the government interferes far too much in business. And because we'd both said, yeah, we'll do it, whatever the topic, we found we were on the other side. So we had to defend the government. The most important thing about the evening was we won. And a relationship which has now lasted probably 20 years was forged in that great moment. There's nothing better, can I tell you, than winning a debate when you start out as the loser and then end up as the victor.
And you remember who the leader of the other side was.
Yeah, we absolutely trashed David Davis, was the point, yes. And actually, it was even better than that, wasn't it? Because he left early, grumpily, while we stayed in the bar to get hammered. Anyway, I digress, and that's got nothing to do with the topic of this evening, but I just wanted you to know that my relationship with Andrew is forged in the fires of debate and trouncing Davis. Now, let's go back to answering my question here. I thought the context should be historical, because, I could talk about the future, I suppose, but that would all be conjecture. And I've got a lot of evidence to defend my point that lifelong learning, and you are all obviously laboratory rats in that particular experiment of lifelong learning is really, really important. So I'm going to start with Santayana, a great quote from Santayana, the Spanish philosopher, who said, "Those who don't study history are destined to repeat it." It's one of the most powerful, I think, and profound messages from an historian that I'm aware of. And as you look around what's happening in the world today, or even in our own country today, so many people have not bothered to study history and are, to our detriment, repeating it. So I'm going to take an historical view, context for answering my own question. And I'm going to do it, first of all, by reference to what I'm calling 3 ages of universal educational evolution. Universal being actually not just kept for rich kids, but for the population. And my 3 ages are defined as the age of control, the age of charity, and then the age of competitiveness, which is the one we live in. And then I'm going to give you I'm going to give you a model to think about lifelong learning, which is obviously what binds us all here today, by looking at 3 priorities for lifelong learning. So let's start with the first age, the age of control. Now, what have control and lifelong learning got to do with each other? Well, the best way to answer that question is to take back to a time when I worked in America. I was very fortunate to work in a company based just north of Boston in Lowell, Massachusetts, a company called Wang Labs, those of you who studied the history of the IT industry. And it was my dream job. It was just so wonderful to move from being in London to working in America. Actually, my dream job soon became working back in London, because actually it was much better than working in America. But that's another story for another time. But my PA, my assistant there, a wonderful lady called Carolyn, presented me with a welcome gift. I didn't know her, presented me with a welcome gift. And it was a book of American business quotations. And we're talking about the 80s. And in those days, America was the place in the world for business. It's become much more evenly distributed across the world now, but it was the place. So I eagerly opened this book of business quotations, thinking I'd find gems. And in fact, there were 2 gems in it. One is completely irrelevant to this afternoon, but it's actually rather good fun. And it does tell you quite a lot about American business culture, which is, if at first you don't succeed, destroy every shred of evidence that you ever tried. But the one that's relevant for this evening and about control was a quote from a man called Jimmy Hoffa. Now, those of you who know anything about American gangsters, the mafia, the mob, the presidents, etc., will have heard of Jimmy Hoffa. He was a trade unionist, as it says there. He ran the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and he disappeared in 1982, hence the question mark. Nobody actually knows when he died. It's a fairly safe assumption it was then, because he's not reappeared. And somebody claimed to know where he was when he died. But anyway, he had a very good line, and this is not an American point now. This is a universal point about control, because he said, if hard work was such a good thing, the rich would have kept it for themselves. And I think that's just so powerful, because A, it's clearly true, but more importantly, in the context of lifelong learning, it also applies to education. Now, we take education for granted in the 21st century, but we are a rather privileged century. And as you will know, as Beckians, it hasn't always been the case that anybody who had the brains to be educated would then be educated. And it was this man, Samuel Whitbread, of the Brewery family, in fact, he was a scion of the founder of the Brewery family, who decided that teaching the poor was a good idea. Teaching those who could not afford to send their children to expensive schools was a good idea. And he introduced the Parochial Schools Bill in 1807. It failed. It didn't get through the 2 houses. And the opposition to it, think of Jimmy Hoffa. If education was such a good thing, the rich would have kept it for themselves. And guess what they did? The establishment kept it for themselves. And Charles Manners Sutton was the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1807, in fact, longer than that, but in 1807 when the bill was questioned, and he said, was raised, and he said the following, and I'll read it out for those of you that are hard of sight and so on. The provisions of the bill left little or no control to the minister in his parish, i.e. the most important thing about control was the minister in the parish. We're thinking a long time ago in the Church of England. This would go to subvert the first principles of education in this country, which had hitherto been, and he trusted would continue to be, under the control and auspices of the establishment. And their lordships, he was speaking in the House of Lords, and their lordships would feel how dangerous it might be to innovate in such matters. I.e., we don't want to teach people, full stop, not even anything else, full stop. So this was the time, of course, Industrial Revolution, children working in factories and so on. They were seen as labour, not as people. And he was joined in the lower house, which is where Whitbread was, by a chap called, he had one extra ride at his own point, which is their lordship's prudence would no doubt guard against innovations that might shake the foundation of our religion. And it would be a chief object of their vigilance and care, i.e. no, I do not want people to be taught to read and to write and about science and so on and so on. And he was supported in the lower house by a man called Davies Giddy, he changed his name subsequently, but you don't need to worry about that. That's an irrelevant detail unless you're doing weird name changes in the 18th century. But he said he must totally object to the principle of the Parochial Schools Act, however specious in theory the project might be, of giving education to the labouring classes of the poor. It would be found to be prejudicial to their morals and happiness. It would teach them to despise their lot in life, instead of making them good servants in agriculture and other laborious employments to which their rank in society had destined them. So you see the link with Jimmy Hoffa there, which is if education was such a good thing, the rich would have kept it for themselves. And back in the early 19th century, the rich and the church did their best to keep education away from people. Why? Because that way they could control people. So the first age of thinking about universal education, or in this case not universal education, was about control. My second age is in charity. A lot of people, Whitbread being an example of them, thought that that was wrong. And so what happened was people, and Whitbread was an abolitionist as well against slavery, so people who thought that humans were humans, as opposed to that class meant you could distinguish between humans and not humans, people began to worry in this country, and this is all about this country, people began to worry in this country about the poor man, the working man, and so on, and it was only men. This is a second order problem, but it was only men. But how men should be educated. And one of the great leaders of the I suppose the Enlightenment really, but the charity focus on education was John Ruskin. Now John Ruskin was a very strange man. If you are interested in history and want to read about people, John Ruskin is definitely somebody worth reading about because he was strange. I won't go any further than that. No, actually, I won't go any further than that because this is also being live streamed. So anyway, he was just strange. You can do your own study to find out what I mean by that. However, he was also a polymath, a genius in many, many different subjects, science, the arts, poetry, etc., etc. And his argument was, and again, I'll read it for those of you who are sight challenges, his argument was, I've listened to many ingenious persons who say we're better off now than we ever were before. I don't know how well off we were before, but we cannot be called as a nation well off, while so many of us are either living in honest or in villainous beggary, i.e. poverty and ignorance. And he wrote books. Well, he wrote a book with lots of papers in it called Fors Clavigera, Letters to the Workmen and Labourers of Great Britain. So this man who was not a labourer, but was an intellectual, decided he would help to educate the working man and the working man's families. And he established something called the Guild of St. George. And the Guild of St. George opened up a museum in Sheffield, which he chose because it was the epicenter of industry in the country at the time. And it's a place, the museum is a place called Walkley, or if you're from Yorkshire, it's not pronounced Walkley, it's pronounced differently, but anyway, it's still Walkley. And what he did, he filled this museum with interesting objects, paintings, interesting bits of gemstones, plaster casts, drawings, artifacts, and so on, and opened up this museum for free to the working man and the working man's family. And he chose a building at the top of a hill. And he chose a building at the top of the hill so that two things would happen. The people who were interested in discovering about these amazing objects that otherwise they would have no interest. And remember, we're talking about time, obviously, before television, before radio, before any kind of mass communication. So these were marvels to be able to be observed that until this were the preserve of the rich. And so this was a really, really big deal. It wasn't just a load of artifacts in a room, it was a really big deal. And he built it at the top of the hill for two reasons. He wanted them to be able to enjoy the artifacts away from the smog, which was filling the valley below, but also he wanted them to see the beauty of the valley in which they worked, because they were doing 12-hour days in the factory, their children were working in the factory, so they were obsessed with essentially making other people rich, and he drew them out of hell, really, and up into something of beauty. His collection is still available if ever you find yourself in Sheffield with a little bit of time available. But what's really telling about it is not the objects, because we're just around the corner from the British Museum here. You can see many more similar objects. But the vision that went into it. And the purpose here wasn't for the ruling classes. It wasn't for the establishment. It was for the working man. It was the concept of universal education. So we've had the era of control, and then the era of charity. And lots of people did what Ruskin did. And then the third age, and we're in the third age now, is the age of competitiveness. And it's very different. If you listen to, well, you don't have to listen to, because it's still going to happen whether you listen to it or not, but were you to listen to current politicians, their rhetoric is generally in one of two areas, apart from talking about themselves, is in one of two areas. And those are either what's right with this country or what's wrong with this country, but in both cases it's relative to other countries. So the nation is seen by our leaders to be in competition, not in cooperation with other countries. And there are all kinds of examples of it. There's no need to go into them because you're all as familiar as I am with them, but it's not new. And of course, we're not in the same kind of competition that we were 100 or so years ago. And if we go back to the end of the First World War, which was a monumental competition, it was a competition clearly between forces of good and evil, we would say, but it was a terrible time, but with echoes today with what's happening in Ukraine. But if you go back to the end of the First World War, the time after the First World War in the UK, there were lots of visionaries who'd moved on beyond the things that I've just been talking about. They saw the working man, of course, had gone to fight for the nation and therefore was a valuable asset as opposed to cannon fodder, for example. They saw the working man as important. And again, I'm afraid it is still men. Women begin to be enfranchised later. But they saw this is really, really important, and education playing a key role in supporting those people who now cease to be, as it were, a liability and labour, as you would see, farm animals, and began to be real people and fellow citizens. And the Master Balliol College, which is Oxford College, but despite that is quite a good place. The Master, says the Cambridge man on the stage here, the Master of Balliol College, Arthur Smith, shared a report into education. And he said, and again, I'll read it for those of the site's not so good. He said, long ago, some foreign critics pronounced us as a profoundly uneducated people who knew no foreign languages, worked short hours, substituted, quote, good form for efficiency, depreciated teachers, had no respect for knowledge, given over to sport and games, holidays and weekends, not to mention strikes and drink. I remind you of Santayana's comment that those who don't study history are destined to relive in it. Now, what he's saying, so clearly the things we worry about today are not new, but what he produced this report which talked about, which recommended lots of ways, Workers' Education Association, etc., lots of ways for people, the population, to be educated by now a grateful state that had survived because of the actions of the people in defending the nation in that First World War. And so we see three stages. We see the era of control, keep education for ourselves. The next area is, well, no, that's terribly mean. Let's scatter some good things around for the people because it'd be good for them, their mental health and so on. And then finally, an important realization in 1919 that education of the population would enable us to become a much more productive nation than we then were. If you listen, actually, I gather that Liz Truss has given a lecture today or speech today on what's wrong with our productivity. And she blames now what is it? I have to get this right, the economic orthodoxy. Well, orthodoxy is what I've just been railing against in those earlier 2 points. And this idea of universalizing, if that's a word, education is not that old. There's nobody in the room who's as old as being born in 1919, but it is our parents' and grandparents' time that it began to become accepted that everybody should have an education. Now, that's an education, but also at that time, lifelong education, and remember, Birkbeck is 200 years old. So at that time, lifelong education began to be recognized, not just primary and secondary education. So what I wanted to share with the Birkbeck audience was a way of thinking about how we can learn from that past, not repeat it, but then more importantly, work to improve the competitiveness in our country, and actually just think through what we mean by competitiveness. And I want to offer a simple model that there are three dimensions in which we need to think about lifelong learning. It's not just me getting interested in art, going to the British Museum and sketching. It's much more fundamental to a happy democratic society. And I'm arguing there are three dimensions to it. The personal, so what I've just described, it's good for me as a working skill. But that's only one piece of education. It's good for me for my mental health, just to admire art and understand it and be able to get into these things. So it's good for me personally. And if I'm a better worker and a more productive worker, it's good for more than just me. It's good for the nation. But to be a worker, I've got to be in a business, in some kind of organization, some institution. And so I'm saying there are three dimensions to think about lifelong learning and education: personal, commercial, and therefore national. I just want to say a little bit about each of those three as a way of thinking about what we should be doing, and equally why what you are doing as adults still seeking to learn more, not necessarily for your job, is fundamentally important to the health of the nation and the success of the nation. So let me start with personal competitiveness. I'm big on quotes today, but Mahatma Gandhi has a really great quote, which was quoted by my friend Lord Billamoria, with whom I served on a commission looking at lifelong education. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But Karen Billamoria is a Zoroastrian, Indian heritage, obviously very keen on quoting Indian philosophy. But this is such a powerful point, I think. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, live to the full, but learn as if you were to live forever. You could never know too much. And if you think back to school when you were so glad to, maybe I shouldn't universalize this, but when I was so glad to finish my GCSEs as they were in those days, and then to finish, so my O-levels they were in those days, and then my A-levels, then get the heck out of the place. But actually, everybody saw in those days that you kind of finished, lots of my colleagues just finished learning. And they went into jobs and they may have learned a few things, but they didn't see the need to keep learning. I was lucky to, and we'll talk about this perhaps later, to go up to Cambridge, where I read a lot of things, not particularly deeply, it has to be said, which was reflected in the quality of my degree, but I learned an enormous amount when I was at Cambridge, because I didn't know the Mahatma Gandhi quote then, but I certainly saw it was. I'll never forget walking through the stacks in the university library, thinking, gosh, I'll never be able to read all of these books, but that doesn't matter, because all of these books will always be here for me to read when I want to. And that idea that learning is forever is a fundamental one that matters for the personal competitiveness, because, as Andy was very kind to say in the introduction, I have been rather fortunate in my business career, actually in my life generally, in my business career, and I attribute so much of it to learning. And I learn, as you're all doing, I learn every day. I think it's important to know more. There are lots of things that I don't know that annoy me, lots of things I used to know that I can no longer understand. I've got a book next to the loo at home on calculus, and it's really annoying me. I used to be ace at calculus, and I'm now struggling to understand what it is. And I never get beyond about page 4 before I finished in the loo, so I never get to the next bit. But I am determined, before I die, which I hope will be a long time yet, to crack that. So personal competitiveness is really important. And although there's nothing wrong, do well, do good, in helping other people, you can only do that if you've got the wherewithal, and that's competitiveness. So the first of those 3 circles is personal. The second is national. Now, you don't have to, was it John Harvey Jones, who used to run ICI, which used to be a company in this country, and then went on television and advised businesses on how to do things. He used to talk about wearing Union Jack underpants. There are limits to jingoism and nationalism and so on, and I guess underpants probably is the limit. But if we don't get the nation to be competitive, you know what, we won't be able to fund the health service, we won't be able to fix broken roads, we won't be able to do the things that we won't be able to educate our children. And so national competitiveness is not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. There is an argument, which I don't accept, which says that actually national competitiveness is a zero-sum game, and we do well, other people suffer. It's patently not true, because if you look at the history of the world, Santayana again, the whole world is doing better than it once was, even though, as Ruskin said, he doesn't believe it, but the whole world is doing better than it was, because we've been able, either deliberately or accidentally, to share the fruits of discovery, of science, of technology, and so on. So national competitiveness is a good thing, not a bad thing, but it's also a very important thing. And I mentioned the Centenary Commission on Adult Education, but I was a member of it. In 2019, we did an update of the little blue book there that I was talking about before, and ironically, or possibly poetically, it was led by the Master of Balliol College. So there's a pattern emerging here. They're only ever done every 100 years by the Masters of Balliol College. I'm sure they've got more to offer the world than that, but anyway, that is one consistent thing. And she said in her preamble to the report, we've been struck by the strength of feeling across the country and from the full range of organizations that it is now vital and urgent to invest in adult education and lifelong learning for the good of our democracy, our society, our economy, and for the well-being of our citizens. The last is the personal point that I've just been making, Mahatma Gandhi, and the rest of it is about the nation being efficient and competitive and trouncing what was said in 1919 when the gentleman quoted Germans and others on how inefficient this nation was. So we've got personal and national competitiveness. And the engine that will make that happen, apart from education, is, of course, business. It's commerce. Because that's where wealth is created and then turned into taxes and state support and so on. So the third and last of my 3 dimensions is commercial competitiveness. And here I'm jumping away from history and bringing my own views to bear. For a long time, I've been involved in various different maneuvers to drive social justice in the country, social inclusion in our country. It annoys me that people can have a privileged route to the top to run things, and people with equal or better talent, more to the point, are held back, and they're held back because they've not had the same life chances. So I have, for example, Andrew mentioned it, started a charity called the Alito Foundation, which seeks to find young people in their early 20s who've experienced tough reality, come from tough reality backgrounds, best way to put it. There are many different definitions of that. It might be poverty, it might be broken homes, etc., etc. It might be refugees, whatever, but tough reality backgrounds, which meant that they've not had the privilege that those who've had comfortable lives, like my children have had, for example, gone to good schools and then on to good universities. And yet we want people like that in the leadership cadre in the country, because we need people running our country, running our businesses, etc., our institutions, who've got a range of experiences. They shouldn't all have gone to one public school and one university and then they run everything. And so for years, I have talked to senior people in businesses to try to persuade them to do more, to hire people from what I'm calling tough reality backgrounds. And for years, people have been really polite to me, and have nodded politely and then said they really agree with me and I made a very good point. And then they've sent me off to HR or CSR, who've already got a program and they're not very interested. But I'm out of the office of the chief executive. And one day it occurred to me that, because I'm a slow learner, it occurred to me that I wasn't making any progress. So nobody actually did anything as a result of agreeing with me that something needed to be done, which I find frustrating. And I coined the first of these, this expression here really, which is a winner. So my point is, companies that don't understand their customers, their supply chains, their employees, their recruitment pools, their regulators, and the communities in which they operate are at a competitive disadvantage to those that do. That's axiomatic. You could argue against it, but it's going to be quite a hard argument to argue against, really. And when I say this to senior business leaders, it's wonderful. The color drains from their face because it's obvious. And they've only hired people who went to the same schools that they went to, whose parents went to the same university that they went to, etc., throughout their entire lives. And there is a reason for doing that, but it's a stupid reason. And the reason for doing that is I know them, so I reduce the risk of these people. But if I hire people I don't know and don't understand, I might actually learn more, and I might actually innovate and do interesting things. So it's a stupid reason for hiring in your own image. When I say this to business leaders, they say, oh, how do I do that? To which I, because I'm a smart ass here, as Andrew pointed out more politely, I say, well, I'm afraid it's about competitive advantage. If there was just a simple formula, it wouldn't be competitive advantage, would it? So you're going to have to go and figure it out for yourself. And then they ask for help, and they often use the Olisa Foundation to help them, and then that all works out rather well in a virtuous circle. But my winning point about this particular one is to say, imagine you're a goalkeeper playing in a local team, and you get injured and you become the manager of a local team, and you need to refresh your football players. Would you go and hire 11 goalkeepers for your team? No. Why wouldn't you do that? Because you know very well that if you have 11 goalkeepers in your team, whilst the other side will struggle to score a goal, it is a fair point, you have no chance of scoring any at all, because you've got nobody who knows how to do the things that happen in football. And if you look at football, it's embarrassing to me that football should be such a great laboratory of obvious inclusion, education, and so on. But if you're a football scout going out looking at playgrounds to find children who can kick a ball really well, if you see a child that's really done a great job with the ball, you don't go and say, now look, young man, young lady, which school did your father go to? What degree did he get? By the way, I know you haven't got a degree yet, but will you be able to get a 2-1? Because it's like, none of that is the fact that you've got the talent to do something the scout can spot and then they develop. Why on earth then in business and institutions don't we go out and find people with the talent and develop it rather than find people that went to the right school or the right university? And the answer is because we are blockheads and we have not yet thought through what we should be doing. And part of the reason why I rant at you this evening is to get some more acolytes who will go out there and spread the message. But my point is, to finish this slide, businesses therefore should recruit, retain, and develop the brightest and most able from the widest demographics representative of the stakeholders that I just listed. It's kind of obvious when stated. It's surprisingly a shock to so many of our leaders. And the Olisa Foundation's job is to find young people with talent and to inject into them the social capital so that they can then compete and hold their own with the people currently in leadership positions. So, to answer my own question and come to the end of it, and the question you may remember is lifelong learning, indulgence, or strategic imperative? B, the answer to my own question is, in its third age, the competitiveness age, lifelong learning is far from an indulgence. It's an absolute requirement. It's a strategic imperative for us as individuals. Remember Mahatma Gandhi? Learn as if you're going to live forever. Don't stop. It's a strategic imperative for businesses, my point about talent that I was just discussing, and therefore it's a strategic imperative for the nation. And because I happen to be rather proud of my nation and think we do a wonderful job in many different areas, it's therefore a good thing for the world. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the answer, as I've said several times in case you weren't paying attention, is B. And then finally, I end by saying, oh, my best slide is gone. So much, 50 years in technology. Go on. And my last slide, which you're going to have to imagine now as a projection, says, congratulations to Birkbeck for 2 centuries of promoting lifelong learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken, and I'm sure everybody is as enthusiastic as I am about what you've said and how you've said it, and have lots of questions. So I'm going to try and not drag out this part, but just really ask you perhaps 2 questions, one more sort of educational and perhaps one more personal. So to start with the educational one, I mean, you mentioned, both of you mentioned debating should the government interfere in business. So I suppose the question is, should the government interfere in education? We've had, the Blair years where meeting the competitiveness that you talked about, we had a target of, doing better for 18 to 30-year-olds going to university than various other countries, which of course led to lifelong learning being neglected because it didn't matter. We now have, partly thanks to your commission, a lifelong learning loan entitlement. And I welcome that, but my question there is, to what extent should government interfere in what subjects are covered? Because we see a very clear threat that's going to say, well, history of art, pay for it yourself, but economics, computer science, government will be happy to give you a loan for it.
I have uncharacteristically for me, as Andrew will attest, I have a one-word answer. Ruskin. We don't know. We can't know. One word was a lie. We can't know. We can't know what one needs to know what one is going to do. Peter Bazalgette, who used to be chairman of ITV, speaks very well on the importance of the creative arts in life and energy and industry. And he says there's this obsession with STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. He said, and they're all really important, but the creative arts are also equally important. He said, and so we should not be talking about STEM, we should be talking about STEAM. And I saw him give a lecture on this point, and he ended up this lecture, which was quite powerful, by saying, and if you follow my advice and we think of STEAM and not STEM, it won't be the first time STEAM has powered an industrial revolution. But we can't know. And the particular lecture he gave, he had a group of entrepreneurs, young-ish people, who'd done various things. One was a games developer, computer games developer, etc., etc. Actually, it was quite interesting. One was a games developer. 2 ladies on this particular panel that he had at the RSA were design engineers. So they weren't computer scientists, they weren't medics, they were design engineers, and they'd invented a device and an application that worked on a mobile phone for ladies to detect whether they had breast cancer. So you essentially monitored your chest with this device that they'd invented, and then the algorithms on the phone told you whether things had changed. But they were design engineers like Dyson, the vacuum cleaner chap, and they weren't medics. They found medics to do the bit that they needed. And the last lady was, I'm not quite entirely sure what her discipline was, creative arts again though. She had decided to set herself against the waste in textile manufacturing. So you know how you make textiles. There's this enormous great mill that produces huge rolls of cloth, which then gets cut and then the rest is thrown away. And it's something like 40% of cloth is thrown away. She combined 3D printing, the jacquard mill, to produce just an item of clothing. And she was fully dressed in clothing which she'd printed one of with no waste. So creative, but obviously the science and technology and engineering and maths in what they were doing. So the argument, I think, is Ruskin, which is we need to be as polymathematic as we can possibly be, so that we can be innovative as opposed to just going down some very narrow corridor.
And I think just to supplement that, I mean, it resonated with me, certainly, when you spoke about chief executives sort of more or less saying to you, how do I get you out of my office and send you along to HR?
Happens to be
because we had that very much with ministers saying, lifelong learning, wonderful, it's all wonderful. Now get out of my office so I can go back to thinking about 18-year-olds with a college scarf. So I guess it's sort of been answered a bit by the lifelong learning. But how would you answer that? How do you say to ministers that actually that is something, that it doesn't end at 30 or 50 or whatever?
I have to say, my great skill in life has never been explaining things to ministers with any luck. But Andrew
Maybe I should ask my
Carr,
chairman.
I've brought along this evening my lovely young assistant who spent a lifetime in the civil service. There must be an answer to that question, and it's a really important question, and the answer is important. I don't know.
Okay. And well, I'm going to switch to the personal now because, of course, I've been reading about you in the last couple of days, and one knows, as Andrew said, that you didn't come from the sort of what people would call the right sort of background, and very often when people have made it with that, it's all about a particular teacher inspiring them. I think you've said that you had that at primary school, and yet then one starts to read and think, well, now the secondary school is going to go really well. He's got into grammar school, he's going to do really well there. More inspiring teachers, get to Cambridge and whatever. But it wasn't really quite like that, was it? Secondary school. So perhaps a little bit, if we could, about your journey through primary school and secondary school.
Well, there's a story which is everybody. I've told this story so many times, so if I apologise if you, I doubt you've listened to any podcasts from me, but if you have, I apologise. Tell the story again. But it was one of those moments that I look back at the time. It was weird, but I look back on it now, and I've looked back over it many times to see two things: the point we're making this evening about the importance of learning, and so on, but also the kindness of. I had a headmaster at junior school, Mr. Spencer, and I was at a Victorian building school in Nottingham, in the poor part of Nottingham. And in those days, it was completely normal for people to sit on the floor, so we sat on the floor for school. Every morning we'd come to assembly, and Mr. Spencer would have played or be playing a gramophone record of classical music. And then he would discuss the classical, or he would describe, he wouldn't discuss it with us, he would describe the classical music to us. So when I hear particularly Kathleen Ferrier comes back, ringing back to me, because he played that quite, it was obviously his favourite. When I hear music that was played to me all that time ago, I would think of Mr. Spencer, who didn't, none of the rest of us were having classical music played at home. It was just one of those things, and I talk about social capital, that means I can never, ever be thrown to one side by someone talking about opera or whatever from age 8, 7 and 6. But the exciting thing about Mr. Spencer wasn't that. Back to all the points I was making in the introduction this evening, he'd obviously had a bad war, and I'm sure he was a socialist. I didn't know that. I don't know I would have understood it at that time. But one day, he gave us a lecture. So we're all sitting on the floor. It's cold. The next thing's lesson. We've probably done the Lord's Prayer and all those kind of things. He's come to the end, and he did this valedictory lecture for the morning, and he talked about the establishment and how the establishment ran the country, and their mission, back to Jimmy Hoffa, was to keep it for themselves and not to share it. But we're 8 years old. This is the most bizarre. He's obviously going mad. And the teachers on the stage are also looking at him a little bit in the, do we have to get a bucket of water or sand or do something with this chap? And he said, and the establishment speaks its own language. He said, and they do that to keep everybody else out. He said, and two of the words that the establishment use are champagne and caviar. So, teachers now reaching for buckets of water and sand. And he said, you're all too young to try champagne, but you're not too young to try caviar. And he put his hand in his pocket, and he brought out a 2-ounce jar of caviar. Teachers used to wear very large jackets in those days. He put his hand in the other pocket and took out a packet of biscuits. And rather like communion, he put a little daub of caviar on a biscuit for each of us in my class. And we went, we then sat down again, and he said, the count of 3, taste the caviar. So, this, 1, 2, 3, oh, horrible. There may be people in the audience tonight who like caviar. I've had an aversion to it since that age of 8. But at age 8, it's horrible. So we're all going, etc. And he said, no, never be intimidated when people talk about caviar. Now, I think that's Ruskin again, isn't it? That's hugely powerful. That's somebody who didn't have to do that, doing something, it wasn't in the curriculum, it wasn't defined, etc. And it made a fundamental difference. So I put him down as age 8 as a springboard into thinking things through, as opposed to just doing what you're told. The curse of rote learning. I won't bore everybody tonight with other great teachers. I had a lot of really bad ones. But the point you wanted me to make, I know, because I had a headmaster on with whom neither I nor my mother got, as we say in this country. And it was mutual. He didn't get on with me. I remember one day when I was probably 15, my mother went to complain about something else he'd done, which was terrible. And he said, look, pointing at my mother, which was a scary thing. My mother was quite scary. Look, he said, you, pointing to my mother, think you can teach better and run this school better than I do. Take your boy to another school. And I'm thinking, no, all my friends are here. Please, Mum, please, just don't embarrass me this time. Anyway, he was a dreadful, dreadful man. And I ended up running the school underground magazine, or Blip, which I produced on a hectograph. None of you have any idea what this is because you've grown up in the era of printers and so on. But essentially, you typed with a form of carbon paper on a piece of paper, then you laid it on a bed of jelly. The ink went into the jelly. You took it off. You put a piece of paper on it. You rolled a roller over it, and guess what? The ink came back out onto the paper. So I'd be there madly in the middle of the night producing the underground magazine, which was devoted entirely to tearing down the school and the system. As a result of which, I didn't become head boy. There's a longer story there, but you don't have time for it now. And then I managed to get into Cambridge, and he had to make me head boy. And gosh, did I have a really, really good last term at my school. We haven't got time for that story now.
I think we should thank you for that, and I think that certainly amplifies what I read online and gives even more insight into the background. But perhaps a few questions from the audience, if we can. We have a little time, so Mike to Kate.
Gentleman there. Oh, microphone coming out.
Yes, we have a microphone.
Yes, I
coming
thought you were
around.
just ignoring me.
Or you can shout.
But that's okay.
Well, it's a very loud mic. Thank you very much for your lecture tonight. I've been a big fan of your work, and I've only seen you remotely, so it's good to see you in person.
I'm actually much taller in real life.
So I suppose my question is really around, it's related to AI and such, right? But are there any kind of topics or things that we need to be learning about to kind of be competitive in this day and age?
Well, yes. I used to. My day job business is helping technology entrepreneurs grow their businesses and make them successful. I call it a merchant bank. I call it a boutique merchant bank. But I was once interviewed by Evan Davis on Radio 4. He got me to describe my tiny little business. He said, boutique, don't you think a kiosk, a merchant bank, would be a better description? So there are 4 partners in my company, and our job is to help people, entrepreneurs in technology businesses, to avoid the dangers of early stage businesses and so on. And I've been doing it for a long time. But of course, in the long time that I've been doing it, every business has become a technology business. You can't do business in the 21st century without electricity and technology. So the tech bit is no longer as exciting as it used to be. So my first part of the answer to the question is yes, but think about technology because it's ubiquitous. And then think about your own businesses, think about areas where technology isn't and see whether you can take it there. And there are still lots of those untrodden paths. And if that's not the case, then go where technology is and the people leading the organizations are seeing the benefits of it. So if you think about, it's a good example, I don't know, the high street in this country, 20 years ago, department stores everywhere, and Amazon comes along, department stores go out of business. They only go out of business because they didn't spot what was happening to them. Actually, they spotted it and they denied it. So the opportunity to do well yourselves is to find where people have either not spotted trend or are in denial of the trend. And you can either help them or you can avert them and move on. But trends are everywhere. And I was lucky enough to go into IT. And when it wasn't IT, it was computing. Again, just back to an earlier point, Vice Chancellor, on how do these things happen. Is it an inspiring person or is it luck? Actually, I'd say those are both the same thing. I went into IT for the following reason. In the sixth form, when I was at school, my grammar school, we had a choice on a Friday afternoon. You could either go cross-country running, or you could go to Nottingham University, we're in Nottingham, a local university, and learn computer coding. I had no idea what computer coding was, but I did know it wasn't outdoors, it didn't involve communal showers, there would be no rain, and there's probably coffee. So I only went to do it because of that reason. And now you see someone who spent 50 years in technology. So my point isn't you can plot all these careful things. You've got to seize. Carpe diem is so key. Seize the opportunity when it comes. But technology now, and I don't mean just computing. Think about what's happening with the green revolution, the environmental revolution. I think that's going to be as big or bigger and easily as exciting as IT has been in my lifetime. Before IT, chemical engineering in general and oil and gas in particular were the equivalent things that grew enormously. It makes sense to associate yourself with something which is going to give you energy, going to have its own energy that you can take, rather than you've got to create it all yourself. So my message is everything is technology, but there are lots of areas where the technology is still primitive. Medical science and technology is still, again, early doors. So find those areas and attach yourself to them. Great thing about technology in the 21st century, you need a range of, back to Peter Bazalgette's point, you need a range of skills to take advantage of it. It's the T in STEAM, but all those other things matter as well. So I'm not saying do computer science, I'm saying go where the industries will be growing, and that it's good for the nation, and it'll be good for the businesses, and it'll be.
Have another one?
Yeah, thanks for an amazing talk, actually. My question is really concerning the concept of universal education and in areas where it would be hard to reach. So I'm from Newham Borough, and that's a hard to reach area. I feel privileged to be able to have such a platform in a country where we could get paid to be educated, really. But the problem I've got is with ethics and discipline. So in areas where people can learn a skill and they use that skill, not trying to quote one of the guys before, I'm not sure if it was Ruskin or somebody else you mentioned, but having that education and to use it for good as the companies what you support, I see that as a challenge because ethics, when it's a hard to reach area or marginalized area, vulnerable, however you want to sort of like inverted comma it, is a problem because they don't have as much, so they have to basically climb up the Mount Scamper. And a lot of times when they get that education or that opportunity, they don't go all the way. And so do you have any take or ideas about the ethical leaning on how to infuse the harder to reach communities, let alone the politicians, with the ethical leaning to make that discipline a reality?
That's a brilliant question. As Lord Lieutenant, of course, I've been to Newham lots of times, just to let you know. So I didn't find it particularly hard to reach. I just got on the bus, and so but maybe that's just me. But your question is a really important one because aspiration is what we're talking about here. So I give a presentation when the Alito Foundation, which is the charity that I founded last year, because young people, 22 on average age, some at university, some not at university, but they've demonstrated their leadership potential, are on a summer school, 4 or 5 days boot camp thing, which is what we do to inject as much as we can of what I call social capital in them. And I give a presentation, and I used to give a presentation about my upbringing, which I still do, my background and so on. They're kind of interested in that, but some old bloke gets up to talk about what he did 50 years ago or 60 years ago. It's not really hugely relevant. Their grandparents probably younger than I am. So it doesn't mean much. And so I've changed it around now, and I have a slide I use to get their attention. And I say, you look at this bloke here, his tailored suits, his posh accent, his pinky ring, his knighthood, and so on. So I know what you're thinking. His dad was probably an ambassador or at least a barrister or something. Well, let me show you the house I grew up in. And the house I grew up in is still there in Nottingham, although they have now improved the plumbing. But when I grew up in it, in the 50s, we had a toilet, a lavatory, and it was on the outside. And so to go to the loo, you have to go outside and come back in again. And there's a tin bath hanging on the wall, and we take the tin bath in, and we had a washing machine thing that some of you know this, which you fill with water, connects to gas, heat the water up, fill the bath, have a bath, siphon it out with a hose pipe, carry the bath out, nip to the loo because it's stupid to waste that opportunity, come back in again. So I show a picture of the house and the tin bath and the toilet, which is a photograph of it, and then I show a picture, or I start with a picture of me and the king or the queen and the royal family and the things I do, lieutenant. I say, so the question, the Newham question. The question is, how does a bloke get from this to this? And I draw a straight line from outside toilet to monarch, and a big question mark. And I say, and the answer is not like that. And then I show the same picture, but the line does that. And then I explain some of its luck and some of its skill, some of its bad luck and some of its bad decisions. And I say, every time it's gone that way, and it's gone that way a lot for me in life, there are two, you can pick yourself up, learn from it, lifelong learning, and not make that same mistake again, or try not to make that mistake again, or you can feel sorry for yourself. There are a lot of people who want you to feel sorry for yourself. That helps justify their own failure to achieve their aspirations. And it's a real problem in societies all over the world. It's not just a British problem. It is a particular British problem. And so I find the communities of which you speak, sir, there are spokespeople in those communities that want to tell everybody that they are in fact disadvantaged, it's not fair, and they have no chance. Well, I'm living proof that that's not true, and I'm far from the only example in this country that is not true. There are lots of other countries where it's not true. There are, interestingly, lots of countries where it is true. That's rather important, but it doesn't happen to be true in the country. Telling people that, persuading people of that is really difficult. So for example, what I do as Lord Lieutenant, I focus on trying to find small charities that have done amazingly good work in wherever they are, and several of them in one of three areas: faith, occupation, work, job, education, volunteering, and heritage. Where do you live? Where do you come from? Where does your family come from? And so on. So faith, occupation, and heritage. We find small charities and we convene opportunities for those small charities to come together and meet other small charities that are doing the same thing, and realizing that together they are a force for good. And the faith group, I have 3 councils that manage that. The faith council has been the most effective by so far 8 years as monetary representative. And we had a meeting of about 300 of people from tiny faith-based charities came to a come-together convening thing in Westminster Abbey. One of the happiest moments of my life has been seeing these 300 people just chattering away to each other, Hindus and Muslims and Christians and Scientologists and so on, just talking about how they do good to help other people. Going out, striding out into Westminster, the confidence that what they do is A, really important, B, it's done by lots of other people and they're not alone, and C, the monarch's representative has said thank you. The impact of that is enormous because they're good people to start with. So I am doing my best to be the antidote to the it's not fair and you know what, it's not your fault. You know what, get a life, think things through. Why are you doing that and not this? And it is about leadership. It's about national leadership. It's about local leadership. It's about people like you who are living examples of the point. Because you could be at home now watching television, doing nothing particular, and you poor devils are here listening to me. That's got to be worth something.
I think we will all stride out with more confidence in our lives, but also to the drinks reception. But before we get to that, Andrew is going to say a few words of thanks to Ken for your magnificent words tonight.
Well, thank you, Ken. I was supposed to try and encapsulate Ken's wisdom. I really don't think I can do that. But 2 things I do want to highlight. The first is, in my introduction, I used a rather clunking phrase saying that Ken came from a humble background. Ken came up with a rather better phrase, which I'm going to use in future, and I think is relevant to Birkbeck. You said a tough reality background. And I think that is a much better way of putting it. Not least, some people come from a tough reality background and aren't very humble.
Yep.
But it does capture exactly the people that, or the students that we want to assist, we want to educate at Birkbeck. They're people who have, for one reason or another, and there are actually a huge number of different reasons, have had a background where the reality was tough, where life wasn't easy and they didn't have enough help, and we want to provide them with that help. And Ken, it's great to hear some of the things that you have been doing to help them. The other reflection I had was about lifelong learning. And I do worry that the government, public discussion, and even occasionally we in Birkbeck forget just how important it is to keep on educating our people in our society throughout their lives. I had an aunt whom I loved very greatly, who at the age of 77 started a PhD. She finished it, she published the book, and it got read by really quite a lot of people. So it's even at the age of 77, you should be doing it. But we have some challenges in our country at the moment, which mean lifelong learning is even more important than ever. One challenge we have is that we have a generation cohort damaged by the pandemic we've just been through, who are finding education difficult for not their fault, but because of the impact the pandemic had, the closure of schools, the closure of universities, and the way education had to be given for a period of time. And we have higher rates of dropouts from universities than we've ever seen before. So we have that generation is going to need more lifelong learning, more help in the years to come than previous generations, and we should be preparing for that. And the country itself is going, we are on a downward slide at the moment. I'm old enough to have seen Britain come up and go down and come up, and we will come up again. But we are in a difficult period at the moment, and lifelong learning, re-educating, retraining our people and our workforce are, I think, an essential part of recovery from the downward slide. So Ken, thank you very much for contributing to our bicentenary lecture series. Thank you for what you've done, what you've spoken to us, and in particular, thank you for highlighting the issues which we in Birkbeck hope that we focus upon and which you exemplify more than anybody else. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And for everybody, there are drinks in the foyer where you were at the beginning. Please do join us.